The room was charged before a single word was spoken, the kind of tension you could almost taste in the air. Cameras clicked, lights burned hot, and the audience leaned forward, sensing something explosive was about to unfold.
Ow.
This wasn't just another hearing, it was the kind of moment that would ripple far beyond those walls, confrontation destined to leave people talking for weeks. And then it began. MittRomney.com, in posture but sharp in tone, fixed his gaze on Jasmine Crockett. His words came not as a question but as a challenge, as if daring her to prove her worth, as if her very presence in the chamber was somehow unearned. It wasn't the first time a powerful man tried to frame a rising voice as inexperienced, but the delivery had a sting of arrogance that made the air itself heavier. His condescending question was designed not just to doubt her, but to humiliate her. Gasps whispered through the room. Eyebrows raised. Every camera shifted toward Jasmine, waiting for her response. In that second, it wasn't just her reputation on the line. It was every young lawmaker who had ever been dismissed, every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough, every immigrant family that had worked twice as hard just to be recognized. Romney's smirk suggested he thought he'd already won, but Crockett didn't flinch. Her silence stretched just long enough to pull the entire room into her orbit. The tension thickened. Was she rattled, or was she preparing something more devastating than anyone expected? All eyes locked on her, waiting for the first word, the first sign of whether she would stumble or strike. And in that pause, history held its breath. Because what Jasmine Crockett was about to say next would not just answer Romneyette, would echo far beyond the chamber, setting fire to a national conversation and leaving one of America's most seasoned politicians utterly speechless. What unfolded in that chamber was more than a personal clash, it was a test of values, a stage where America's fault lines were laid bare for all to see. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just Romney taking a jab at Crockett. It was the embodiment of a deeper struggle, tradition against change, entitlement against perseverance, dismissal against dignity. Romney's remarks struck at something primal. It wasn't just political theater, it was symbolic. Wanted to remind everyone who had long held the power to reinforce an old hierarchy that said only certain voices with certain pedigrees belonged at the top of the table. It was less about Jasmine herself and more about what she represented. New blood, flinching defiance, and the audacity to stand tall without apology. But the stakes didn't stop at symbolism. This was a hearing watched by millions, amplified. In real time across social media, phones buzzed, clips circulated, hashtags ignited. Already, the question was taking shape. Would Jasmine Crockett crumble under the weight of a senator's belittlement? Or would she turn this attempted humiliation into a defining moment of her career? The crowd inside the chamber leaned in, hungry for the drama. Porters scribbled notes with the urgency of history unfolding. Beyond the walls, communities who had lived under the shadow of being less than watched with the same urgency, praying for a voice that spoke their truth. And make no mistake, what Crockett chose to say next would not only answer Romney, it would ripple across kitchen tables, college dorms, union halls, in every place where Americans debated what kind of country this really is. This was the tipping point. Either Romney's arrogance would stand unchallenged, or Crockett's resolve would ignite something unforgettable. One path meant silence, the other meant fire, and Jasmine Crockett was about to show the world which one she would choose. Before Crockett could rise to the moment, the figure standing opposite her had to be understood. Mitt Romney was not just another senator in a crowded chamber. He was a man cloaked in decades of privilege, prestige, and political weight. To his allies, he was the polished statesman, heir to a legacy of power. To his critics, he was the embodiment of the establishment and emblem of wealth and pedigree, masquerading as moral authority. Romney's rise had always been cushioned by resources others could only dream of. The son of a governor, fortune of his own. He never had to claw his way into the spotlight. It was always lit for him, the microphone always waiting, the respective institutions granted before he even spoke. His speeches dripped with a kind of certainty that only comes from never having to wonder if you belong. And that certainty, that untouchable aura, had been weaponized countless times to diminish those who had traveled harder roads. But with every polished smile came cracks. His record was riddled with contradictions, speaking of compassion while siding with policies that left working families gasping for air, professing dignity while sneering at those who hadn't lived his gilded life. Time and again, he had crafted the image of moderation, but when confronted with voices that challenged his comfortable worldview, the mask slipped. Arrogance surfaced, sharp and dismissive, cutting through like a blade meant not to debate but to belittle. The hearing that day was no exception. Romney had leaned on the same old playbook: mock, condescend, and expect the room to follow his lead. For years, that strategy had worked. His stature was enough to silence opponents, his calculated, calm enough to keep cameras sympathetic. But here, something was different. Across from him sat not a career politician groomed in the same halls of privilege, but someone who knew the grind, who wore every scar like armor, who spoke with the cadence of lived struggle rather than inherited entitlement. Romney thought his words would be a final verdict, a show of dominance that shut the moment down. Instead, they were gasoline, poured over a spark he didn't see coming. His own hubris set the stage for what would become one of the most unforgettable turnarounds in that chamber's history. And as the silence after his insult hung in the air, it wasn't Romney's voice people waited for. It was hers. The room didn't know it yet, but the balance of power was already shifting. And Mitt Romney was about to find himself on the wrong side of history. Jasmine Crockett's story was not carved from the marble of privilege. It was hammered out of struggle, grit, and a faith that when the world tries to close its doors, you find a way to kick them open. Unlike her opponent, she hadn't grown up in halls where power was inherited like fine china. She grew up where you had to prove yourself at every turn, where nothing was handed and every victory was clawed from the edge of impossibility. Her early years carried the quiet but unshakable weight of responsibility. Crockett knew what it was like to feel invisible in a system that rarely valued voices like hers. But invisibility taught her resilience. She studied, she fought, she sacrificed not because doors were already open, but because she had to break them down. Law school wasn't just an education, it was survival training. She learned to cut through intimidation, to speak when silence would have been easier, to stand tall even when the floor shook beneath her. Her career as a lawyer wasn't about cocktail parties or cable news appearances. It was about fighting for the people the system forgot. Tenants being pushed out by greedy landlords, families silenced by bureaucracy, communities written off as expendable. Crockett's work put her face to face with the consequences of arrogance, the same kind of arrogance Romney embodied that day. Every case hardened her, sharpened her. She didn't just argue for her clients, she carried their stories, their pain, and their hope into rooms where they'd never been allowed before. By the time she stepped into politics, Crockett had already built something Romney could never understand: credibility rooted in sacrifice. She wasn't born into a dynasty, she was born into a fight. Every setback only amplified her determination. Every doubt thrown at her only fueled her fire. When people looked at her, they didn't see entitlement. They saw someone who had walked their roads, shouldered their burdens, and still stood unshaken. That authenticity terrified men like Romney. He was a polished statue of establishment power. She was flesh and blood, scarred but unbreakable. Voice carried the urgency of those whose futures were constantly on the line. And her presence reminded the chamber that real leadership isn't conferred by legacy, it's earned by surviving what others can't. And so, when Romney tried to belittle her with the weight of his title, Crockett had something far more powerful. She had the truth of her journey. She had the lived reality of millions whose voices were rarely heard in those halls. She had a fire that privilege could never extinguish. The room didn't yet know it, but that day wasn't going to be remembered as another polished takedown by a senator of pedigree. It would be remembered as the moment someone who wasn't supposed to fit into the establishment shattered its arrogance with the force of authenticity. And as Romney smirked, convinced of his own superiority, Crockett leaned forward.
Yes.
Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was the kind of silence that comes before thunder. The tension in the chamber began as a low hum, almost imperceptible, like the sound before a storm. Romney leaned back in his chair, his words dripping with calculated disdain, thought this was theater, and in his mind he had already written the ending where his status and polish drowned out the voice of a freshman congresswoman. His allies smirked, waiting for Crockett to falter, waiting for the pause that would confirm their belief that power always wins over persistence. But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward, pen tapping softly against the desk, her eyes locked on Romney with an intensity that stripped away his veneer of untouchable authority. The chamber shifted. That tap wasn't nerves, it was the ticking countdown of patience, and everyone could feel it. Romney pressed harder, layering insult upon insult, cloaking his barbs in what he believed to be wit. He questioned her competence, her experience, even her right to be in the room. His words weren't aimed at debate. They were daggers meant to wound, to remind everyone that, in his eyes, she was an outsider who hadn't earned the privilege of challenging him. The escalation was deliberate. He interrupted her. He talked over her. He tried to cut her presence down with the arrogance of someone who had always believed the room belonged to him. And with each jab, the chamber seemed to tilt further, the tension swelling into something electric. But Crockett didn't meet his arrogance with anger. She met it with composure. Every time he interrupted, she paused just long enough for the silence to sting. Every time he condescended, she tilted her head, a faint smile playing at her lips as if to say, "This is all you've got." The contrast was stark. Romney's polished aggression unraveling into desperation. Crockett's steady calm growing into dominance. The crowd sensed it. The journalists scribbling notes realized the story wasn't going to be about Romney's display of power, it was going to be about Crockett's refusal to bend. Members in the chamber who had initially chuckled at Romney's jabs now sat straighter, watching her with a dawning awareness that something bigger was brewing. The escalation reached its peak when Romney, his voice sharpened by frustration, leaned in with a question meant to crush her, a sneer disguised as a challenge. A verbal blow so heavy he believed she couldn't possibly recover. His words sliced through the air, leaving an echo that dared her to respond. The silence that followed was deafening. Crockett didn't rush. She let the weight of his arrogance linger, let the smugness hang in the air like smoke choking the room. Then she lifted her gaze, steady, unwavering. The chamber seemed to hold its breath, and in that stillness it became clear. Romney had overplayed his hand. He had escalated so far so fast that the only thing left was the fall. Crockett was about to deliver it not with fury, but with precision. The storm he thought he controlled was about to break, and the first crack of thunder was hers to unleash. The silence stretched so long it became unbearable. Silence thick with expectation. A silence that turned every head toward Jasmine Crockett. And then calmly, almost too softly at first, she began. Her words didn't rush. They carved. "Senator Romney," she said, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the weight of the chamber. "You seem awfully comfortable questioning my qualifications. But let me remind you, my qualifications are not measured by the rooms I've inherited. They're measured by the battles I've fought, the people I've defended, and the voices I've carried into spaces like this one." It wasn't a shout, it wasn't anger. It was conviction distilled into language that resonated like a drumbeat. Her composure stunned the room. She wasn't flustered, she wasn't rattled, she was in control. Romney tried to interrupt, but she didn't let him. She leaned forward, her cadence tightening, every phrase landing with precision. "You call me inexperienced, but let's talk about experience. My experience is standing beside mothers who've buried sons to gun violence you failed to act on. My experience is protecting families from eviction notices while billionaires hoard tax breaks. My experience is rooted in survival, in struggle, in service, not in a last name, not in a network of country clubs." The room quaked. Her words weren't just aimed at Romney, they were aimed at history itself. Every syllable carried the weight of generations told they didn't belong, generations talked over and dismissed. The crowd felt it. Pens froze, widened. Even Romney's usual composure faltered. His smirk slipped into something else uncertainty, and then came the blow he never saw coming. Crockett paused, looked around the chamber, and then returned her gaze to him. You think your condescension diminishes me? It doesn't. It exposes you. It shows the country that when faced with truth, your instinct is arrogance. And arrogance, Senator, has never stood the test of time. Dignity has. Service has. Justice has. The words landed like thunder. A murmur rippled across the room. Some members stifled grins. Others shook their heads in disbelief at her composure. On social media, the clip was already beginning to spread. Hashtags forming, captions like Crockett claps backflashing across timelines. Romney tried to recover, stumbling through a half-hearted retort, but the damage was done. Every attempt sounded weaker, smaller, eclipsed by the sharp clarity of her words. He was unraveling, his authority dissolving under the weight of her precision. And then she delivered the mic drop, the line destined to become immortalized in clips, tweets, and headlines. You can try to humiliate me, Senator, but you can't humiliate what I represent. I carry millions of voices with me, voices you cannot silence, voices you cannot erase. And no matter how loudly you try to talk over me, the future will talk louder. Now the chamber erupted, not with applause, but with that rare electricity. When everyone knows they've witnessed a moment that will echo far beyond the walls it was born in. Romney's face hardened, but his silence betrayed him. He had no comeback. And as Crockett leaned back in her chair, calm and unshaken, the message was clear. She hadn't just defended herself. She had shifted the ground beneath his feet. The entire country was about to feel the aftershocks. The aftershocks spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the chamber's tension spilled out onto every screen in America. News alerts blasted. Across phones, Crockett silences Romney in fiery clash, and clips of her takedown were already flooding TikTok, Twitter, and YouTube. Comment sections lit up with cheers, people typing out in real time what millions were feeling: pride, vindication, and the thrill of seeing someone finally refuse to bow. But the most striking part wasn't just the viral headlines, it was Romney's reaction. Cameras zoomed in on his face as Crockett's words echoed in the chamber. The man who once embodied calm establishment power sat exposed, his attempt at control slipping through his hands. Each nervous glance, each tightened jawline, told the story of a politician unprepared for a new kind of resistance, one forged not in polished boardrooms but in lived struggle. For Crockett, the moment wasn't just about clapping back. It was about rewriting the script entirely. No longer was the narrative centered on Romney's question or his authority. The story belonged to her, now, to the fire in her voice, clarity of her truth, and the millions watching who saw themselves in her defiance. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reclamation. Across immigrant households, across communities, long dismissed and sidelined, Crockett's stand resonated like a rallying cry. It wasn't lost on anyone that a black woman standing unapologetically in her own skin had flipped the power dynamic on one of the most powerful names in American politics. To her supporters, it wasn't just about winning a debate. It was about proving that dignity, when wielded with courage, could cut deeper than any insult. And while the room settled into a stunned quiet, the real storm was building outside. Headlines sharpened, pundits scrambled, hashtags soared. America wasn't just watching, they were choosing sides. And the momentum was shifting faster than Romney could ever contain. But what came next would prove this. It wasn't a one-off moment. It was the beginning of something much larger, something even Romney couldn't escape. What lingered after the clash was bigger than a soundbite. Crockett's words, born from experience and sharpened by truth, left behind a lesson that cut through the noise of partisan spin. In a chamber often filled with empty posturing, her response stood as a reminder. Politics isn't about pedigree or privilege. It's about service, sacrifice, and the courage to speak when silence would be easier. The moral clarity of the moment settled into the public's consciousness. Crockett embodied something timeless, the idea that America is strongest when it uplifts those who have carried the heaviest burdens. She represented not just her district, but the working mothers balancing two jobs, the immigrants carving a life from scratch, The young people told they're too inexperienced to matter. Her stand transformed into a universal truth. Dignity will always rise above condescension. And authenticity will always shatter arrogance. As media cycles churned, commentators tried to frame the exchange as just another viral moment. But to the millions replaying it online, it was more than a clip, it was validation. Crockett's rebuttal crystallized the belief that respect isn't granted by elites in power. It is seized by those who dare to speak truth, no matter who stands in front of them. The power imbalance of the chamber had been rewritten in real time, and the message was clear. Authority without empathy is hollow. And arrogance without substance collapses on its own weight. The deeper reflection was impossible to ignore. America, for all its divisions, still hungers for voices that remind us of who we claim to be, a nation where service outweighs ego, where representation is earned through lived struggle, not inherited wealth. Crockett's stand became a mirror, forcing the country to ask, who do we want leading us forward? Those who sneer and diminish, or those who rise from challenge with their head held high? Her words didn't just silence Romney for a moment. They echoed as a call to action for millions to demand better, to demand leaders who reflect the people, not just the powerful. The chamber may have quieted, but outside, the roar of validation was unmistakable, and yet the story was still not complete. Because what followed, how people like you would carry this moment forward, would decide whether it lived as a fleeting clash or a lasting change. So here we are, standing at the close of a moment that was never just about words exchanged. In a chamber, it was about something far deeper, the battle between arrogance and authenticity, between entitlement and earned dignity. Mitt Romney walked in expecting to diminish a voice, to shrink a presence. Instead, he was the one reduced to silence, undone by the calm force of truth that Jasmine Crockett carried with her. And isn't that the real lesson? That in America, greatness isn't handed down from the privileged foot, it is claimed by those who know struggle, who rise through sacrifice, who carry the stories of ordinary people into rooms where they've been told they don't belong. Crockett didn't just win an exchange. She reminded millions that their own battles, their own voices, their own truths are powerful and worth being heard. This is why these moments matter. They remind us that dignity still has a place in politics, that courage still breaks through. The noise, that arrogance, no matter how polished, will always stumble when confronted with conviction. It's a story bigger than Crockett versus Romney. It's about us, about who we choose to be when faced with mockery, when tested by power. Do we shrink back? Or do we rise, unapologetically, with the kind of clarity that cannot be ignored? You felt something here. If this moment lit a fire in you, if it reminded you of the kind of America you believe in, then don't let it end when the video stops. Join us in amplifying voices like Crockett's, voices that prove truth still has weight. Share this story. Talk about it. Make sure the message echoes beyond these walls, because this isn't just a channel, it's a movement. And if you believe dignity deserves a platform, if you believe arrogance deserves to be exposed, then you belong here with us. So hit subscribe, add your voice in the comments. Let's keep building something together. This is Hidden Vote, where the arrogance of the powerful is shattered by the truth of the people. And remember, history is written not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who refuse to stay silent.